Welcome to day 13 of this challenge. Yesterday we took a deep look into input validation, and today we will add entities to our project. Afterwards we will again check some backend validation, but this time in combination with the entities that we are creating. The user interacts with our Angular app on his browser. The Angular app is just the layer in front of the backend application we designed to solve different problems than the ones the front-end applications solve. In real-world applications, we usually need more layers in the architecture. DTOs and read models are collections of fields passed between the client and the server, as we have already covered. DTOs and read models should not be responsible for dealing with domain logic. That's what I mean when I say that we don't use DTOs and read models to write them into the database, for example. So instead of those DTOs and read models, we should use so-called entities. Entities are classes we designed to automate the domain logic or business logic if you are solving a business problem. Developers usually package entities as a separate layer called domain. Today, we will be gradually extracting the domain layer and adding some domain logic. Well, I know that sounds complicated, but don't be concerned. Let's do it in action and you will understand why we are doing this real quick. Okay, welcome to this video. We will now start working on our entities. So we will use our DTOs and read models to convert them into real entities that we could probably save into a real database, or which we could potentially use in a real database, or at least in entity framework, for example, in memory databases. However, I really want to mention that these DTOs and read models and entities, all of this is really expert knowledge. So there are a lot of web developers out there which are just completely ignoring that, right? They simply go ahead and write entities and send those entities directly from A to B and from B to A and all over the network. However, this is really not the best practice. The best practice by far is to create data transfer objects which are just for sending them through different applications. But when it comes to real usage of the information, like a real entity, for example, a user or a book flight information or any other model that you would use in your application, you really want to keep them separate as completely separated entities. So just to get that clear, if you send the information about the flight between applications, you would use a flight read model. But if you want to store the information about a flight, you would use a flight model, even if they have nearly the same or exactly the same information covered. And this is what we call the domain layer. And you really want to make use of it to be a very professional web developer. Now let's start in our application, in our project here. Let's add a new folder. Right click on flights, add a new folder and call it domain. If you take a look at existing applications during your career, you will see that a lot of projects will have that structure. Either they have a domain folder or they will have a separate domain project. Now inside that domain folder, right click and add a new folder and call it entities. Now let's copy over our read model. So open up read models and let's start with the flight read model. So I will open up real quick here. Now right click on that, hit copy. So Control C, right? I will do it here in the drop downs. Now go to the entities folder, right click on it and simply paste. You can now see the flight read model as a duplicate here inside the entities folder. Now I will close what's opened here. Go ahead and open the flight read model in the entities folder since we have to adjust it. We for sure don't want to have a copy. You can see we got a compilation error because now we have that flight read model 2 times, right? Now let's first of all change the namespace from flights read models to flights.domain.entities. We can save it. For sure he's complaining about time place rm missing. Now let's do that. Time place rm, select it in the read models folder, simply copy it and then go back to entities folder, right click and paste it. So now we have that duplicate here too. Open it up, time place read model from the domain entities folder and change it here to flights.domain.entities2. Now you can see that it's here for sure resolved because we now have time place rm in flights domain entities. So just to make that clear, right now at this point we have a folder called domain and a folder inside that called entities, and inside there we have again flight read model and flight time place read model. So right now we have two times the read models. Flight read model here, flight read model here, time place read model here, and time place read model here. Now, later on, inside of our domain entities, we will change the name of those read models. But right now, we stick with it. Let's try out if everything worked. So go ahead and start your application. This should prove you that you have no compilations error. That should prove you that you have no compilation errors. So this is just a test for us to see if we made any mistakes right now. Great, so the application is starting, and as you can see, we have no compilation errors, so we can stop the application and continue from here. Now we need to refactor. Refactor means that we change all the references. So flight read model, we want to refactor it to be called flight RM. And by refactoring, we remove all the references. However, if you right click on it, you go to find all references, you can see that we don't have a reference, right? Because those domain entities, we just created them and they are not referenced. The ones which are referenced are those from the read models folder. So right click on flight RM, click on rename, and simply go ahead and remove RM, so simply call it flight. Now hit apply, and you can see that also the file name changed to flight.cs instead of flight rmcs. So this is very important. Now don't go ahead and simply remove the name and write down the new name. Make sure to make right click and then click on rename to really adjust all the references and the file name. We exactly do the same thing for time place RM. So select time place RM, make sure you're selecting the correct one from the domain entities folder, right click on it, rename, and again write down time place. Now hit apply, and you will also see that the name got adjusted to timeplace.cs. Now, as you can see, those are our entities from our domain, and if we want to write down something into a database or want to use them in our application, we would now go ahead and use time, place, and flight. So if you want to save something to a database, let me say that again, you would not use flight read model anymore. You would now use flight, even though they are completely identical from the setup or from the definitions, right? So flight is now what we want to use when it comes to database, etc. And if we would just send information about flights, you would still go ahead and use the flight read model to send them from a front end to a back end to a mobile application or whatever. So for transferring information, use the flight read model. For storing data, use the flight model. This is important. DTOs and entities. Data transfer objects and entities for permanent and persistent storage. Okay, so this is the first step. And as I said, inside of our controllers, we now really want to decide where we use the flight and the flight read model, right? So we have to adjust some variables and endpoints to make use of the correct entities now. Now let's start implementing our new entities. So go ahead into your flight controller, and first of all, simply go ahead and using flights.domain. Sorry, there's this typo. Flights.domain.entities. Now scroll down to your static private flight list. We got that here in line 16 for me, right? And you can see that this flight information is of type flight read model. Now, in the last video, I explained to you that we, for databases, for example, or storage, would now use the flight model instead of the flight read model, because read models are only for transferring data between endpoints or between applications. Now we go ahead, since this is our in-memory database, right? Later on there would for sure be an SQL database, for example. However, it really results in the same because Entity Framework is our API for that. So we would no longer use flight read model. Let's go ahead and change it. So now let me adjust the data type from flight read model to be flight. For sure, we also have to adjust it here. And now let's open up the list. I got that collapsed. And inside here, you can also see that we use time place RM, and we for sure change it now to be of type time place. For every information that we have inside here, won't take too long. There are just some sample records right now. And afterwards, we have in that list completely removed all read models with our real entities. Okay, so that's fine. You can see that we now have the flights list here adjusted, and inside that list you will no longer find a read model. So make sure that you have replaced flight read model with flight and time place read model with time place. Now let me collapse that list again. And you can see that we have an endpoint called find, not search. Let's just scroll down. Here we got find. And you can see that it is still of type flight read model here. And that's fine. Why do we leave it like this? Because find is like an open endpoint which anyone can call, for example. And as we said, read models are for data transferring. So if you want to communicate with another endpoint or send some information about a flight, you want to send a flight read model, right? So this is correct. Now, however, you can see that we are searching a flight by GUID and we use our flights list, and you can see it's of type flight, not flight read model. So flight here will be of type flight and not flight read model, but we are returning it. So instead of returning a flight read model, we are returning a real flight. You can see that here. So what we do now is we take that flight and convert it from a flight into a flight read model. So var read model equals to new flight read model. And as I already said, they most likely share exactly the same information. So we can go ahead and simply write that down. We take auto-completed here, flight ID, flight.airline, flight.price, new time, place, RM, right? So use read model because here we are sending information. That's why we want to use our read models and data transfer objects. Flight.departure.place.toString, first one, and flight.departure.time, departure.time. Last one, let's copy that over. New time, place, read model, flight arrival dot place to string, and flight arrival dot time. There we go. So, oh yeah, and we got that seats missing. Sorry for this. So here we need our flight dot remaining seats. So right now it's easy for us to do that because our flight read model is 100% identical to our flight model. So the flight read model is just like our flight entity. However, as I already said, the flight read model can contain other informations, way more informations than only the flight if we would like to have it. However, our flight model inside of the database should only contain the information about a flight. That's why we are separating them. Now what we do here is we take the flight that we can find in our flight database, and since we don't send entities over the network, we take the flight and put it inside a read model. So we create a read model here and put in the real flight information so that we then can take the read model and simply return it. And now our endpoint, which should return a flight read model, is again returning a flight read model. So I have said it 100 times, but just I want to mention it one more time. Endpoints should return the information in data transfer objects or read models. And if we receive information for posting, we again take read models and data transfer objects, take them and then convert them into entities and save those entities. You know, later on it's completely up to you which way you go. If you want to decide, or if you decide to simply go ahead with only entities and you want to skip read models and all of this, feel free to do it. Because it really depends on you and you're the one who's responsible for it in the end, right? But we have to teach you the most professional approach. So if you think or feel like, okay, I really don't need to use it, then go ahead, do it, right? But we need to tell you how it's done professionally so that you, if you come across a program and see read models and entities inside of a domain, for example, that you know why this is taking place and that it's a common practice to do it that way. Let's just dig a little bit deeper in that topic. In the next video, we will have a small presentation again about it. So now we need to adjust our second endpoint. Go ahead into that first endpoint that we already fixed, find, right? And now take that piece of code here where we just create a new flight read model. So copy it over, scroll a little bit up. You can see that we have our search endpoint here and it's simply returning flights. So we expect it to be the return type of type IEnumerable, so any collection, and then of type flight read model. But our flight list or array is for sure now of type flight, not flight read model anymore. So let's go ahead and adjust it. What we will do is we will convert that flight array into a flight read model array using link. Well, we will write an expression for that. First of all, we create a new flight RM list, for example. so all of the informations. And then we go ahead into flights. This is our flight array, dot select. We select all of them. And then for each flight in that array that we have, we want flight goes to, and now we can paste our code. So the new flight, we convert it into a new flight read model. Let's remove that semicolon here. And then we can simply go ahead, leave it like this, and add a dot to array. Now check flight RM is of type flight read model now. Let's simply return that flight RM list. You can for sure adjust the variable name as you like. You can call it flight RM read model or whatever. Just wanted to show you that we now again have a flight read model. Let me explain you what's happening here a little bit more in depth. So as I said, we return, or we should return, a flight read model list. Our flights, the list where all the information is inside, is of type flight now, since we changed it to be, well, matching our domain entity. Now we want to have all the information about the flights to convert it from a flight array list, or from a flight array, into a flight read model array. This is why we go into our flight array, take all the flights, so every single flight in it, and for each flight inside of that array, we run this. So we take the flight, convert it or create a new flight read model and pass in the values of the selected flight. Afterwards, once everything here is done, we can simply take that collection of flight read models and create an array from it. Now we can go ahead and return it. You can even simply remove to array if you want to keep it as an IEnumerable, right? So you can leave it like this. Still working. Now it's not an array. Now we simply go ahead and return an IEnumerable. But I want to show you that you can take a collection like IEnumerable and bring it to an array, to a dictionary, hash set, or to list, right? However, if you want to keep it an IEnumerable, you can simply go ahead and leave it like this too. Great. So this is all we have to do. Now we converted our flight array into a flight read model array or collection. However, this is important because if you use your domain models, this is something you really want to do pretty much often, right? So since you're not sending the information about your flight entities, you want to use your flight read models. So if you have a flight array, you maybe want to switch them or convert them into a flight read model array, for example. Great. Now let's save it. Now, if you make those changes, it's very important that you test your application. So simply go ahead and start it and check if search and finding a flight is still working. So here we are in Swagger. Let's go ahead and try to grab our flight here. Simply try it out, hit execute. You can see that we still got our list. That's very nice. Now select one GUID here, which you can find. Let me cancel that. Let me go to the get flight endpoint. So find one by ID. Let me click on try it out. Let me paste in the GUID. Let me hit execute. You can see the response is returning one of the flights. So everything is still working. That's fine. So we now have adjusted our flight controller to return the correct information. So inside of the controller, as data storage, we use our flight entity, which is correct. And for getting and sending information, we are now using our read models, which is also correct. Read models, DTOs for sending information, and entities for storing information. Now that we have adjusted our flight read model, passenger read model, and time place read model, we should go ahead and also do that with our book DTO. So go ahead and open up the DTOs folder, and you can see the book DTO right here. So again, go ahead and copy it, right click, copy, go into your entities folder and paste it right here. Now open it up, book DTO, and first of all, let's change the namespace to be namespace flights domain dot entities. Next, let's remove the data annotations and remove all of the attributes that we have used here when we talked about validation, so that we again only have the properties flight ID, passenger, email, and number of seats. Now let's adjust the name. Right click on book DTO, hit rename, and now call it booking. Hit apply, and on the right side check that the file name is now called booking.cs. Great, so now let's switch over to our flight controller and scroll a little bit down. Here you can see our list with book DTO. called bookings, right? And we for sure have to do exactly the same like with our flights list. For storage, we should not use any DTOs. So let's go ahead and adjust the type to be of type booking. Do exactly the same thing for the initialization here, new list of type booking. And now let's scroll a little bit down until we come to the book action. If you cannot find it easily by scrolling, go ahead in that drop down and check for book. There we go. Now here you can see that we have bookings.add_DTO throwing an error because bookings for sure is of type booking and DTO is for sure of type book DTO. So now inside of that add, we can create a new booking. You can for sure also do that inside of a variable outside of that add call, but we can go ahead and say, for example, like here, new booking inside there, DTO.flightID, DTO.passenger email, and DTO.number of seats. Great. So now we generate a new booking based on the DTO, and that new booking here, that instance, for sure will be able to get added to the bookings list that we have now just, switched over. Okay, now scroll again to the very top, and the list that we have created here, we will now prepare that for Entity Framework later on, so that we can easier switch. Just think about that. A flight can have bookings, right? So right now what we have here is we have flights and bookings. But later on we want to go ahead and connect those, two tables so that we say, hey, a flight has a number of specific bookings, right? They are attached to them because a booking is always attached to a flight. Now select that list here, right click and simply cut it. Now go ahead into our new entity called flight, right exactly here, and then just go to the bottom of the record and add some curly braces, and inside of that record you're now gonna paste it, so simply Ctrl V, and instead of making it static private, which doesn't make sense anymore now, we make it public. So a flight record has a public list of bookings which are attached to them. Now let's switch back to our flight controller. Scroll again a little bit down until you come to the same point where we just stopped last time here. And he is trying for sure to add the new booking that we have just created to add it to the list, but the list is not existing anymore because now the list of the bookings of the flight are inside of the flight. So here in line 126 for me, you can see that Boolean value flight found. Go into the flights list and search for a flight with a specific ID and tell me if you found one. So instead of having that a Boolean, let's now switch it to be of data type flight. So simply hit rename, let's call it flight. And instead of using any, which is returning a bool, we go ahead and use single or default, which will return one value or for example null. So go ahead and find that one flight with that GUID where the DTO, where the flight ID is matching the DTO flight ID. So checking if the flight is false doesn't make sense anymore now. Let's check if it's null. If flight equals to null, return not found. Now instead of calling bookings.add, we now go ahead and call flight.bookings.add because the bookings list is now inside of the flight. And as you can see here, the flight is of type flight entity. So our entity, right? And inside that entity, we now got that list. So we simply find the flight and then go into the bookings of that flight and add a new booking to it. Awesome. Now let's start the application. Now let's search for flight. Let's book this one here. And I'm already registered, so I can simply go ahead and book now. So let me just book, for example, 5 seats and my booking works. So this is fine. Inside of the console, see booking 5 passengers for the flight. So still working, that's very good. Now we need to do the same thing just one more time with our new passenger DTO. And afterwards we have completely switched from DTO usage to entity usage. Now, as we did previously, we also want to change it from our new passenger DTO to create an entity which is called passenger. So select the new passenger DTO, simply copy it and paste it again inside of our entities. And again, go right into it, new passenger DTO right here. We go ahead and remove all the data annotations that we got until we only have left all of the properties. There we go. And now we take it, just the namespace, flights, domain, dot entities, and rename the new passenger DTO, right click, rename to be passenger. There we go. This is what we could potentially write into a database, right? Passenger is a nice naming for a table, for example. Now go into the passenger controller and again adjust our list that we have here, new passenger DTO, right? Make it of type passenger. As I said already, it repeats all the time. So for sure he doesn't know the namespace. Let's go ahead and add the namespace using flight domain entities. And in initialization, passenger, use new list of type passengers for sure. Sorry, of type passenger. There we go. Now let's scroll down because he's complaining here already. And again, instead of adding the DTO, we will create a new passenger, right? And inside of that passenger, we will again use the DTO information. So DTO.email, DTO.firstname, and DTO.lastname, finally DTO.gender. Now we have completed our new passenger and added that one now to our passenger list, which is of type passenger entity. So now that's working fine. Okay, great. So now we have switched the complete application. Instead of using DTOs and read models for storing in lists or databases, or however you call it, right, any kind of storage, we now use entities inside of our domain layer of our application. Great. So this is all what was covered for today. And you might wonder, why do we separate the domain layer and we don't simply use the DTOs and read models? I tried to explain it during implementation, but no worries, we will again answer this question in detail tomorrow. See you there.